where he's chasing someone. I'm not exactly sure if I remember correctly. I think it was Heather Langenkamp's Nancy, but he lifts up his shirt and he just slices, and it's just this very grotesque shot of like maggots and blood mixture just kind of pouring out. And so you kind of get those early wisecracking, but this is a much more serious version of the character, I feel like. But you have the early origins of those traits that he would later be gone and known for. And I think that's kind of what people really know Robert Englund for, is that kind of that humor. Like, he's really the one that, you know, he's out of all the slasher icons, he's the one that talks. He's the only one that really talks outside of Ghostface. He is really the only one that kind of makes jokes, and I think that you need someone like Englund to do that. And Englund, I think throughout the entire course, we've seen him encompass all that is Freddy-Krueger, because you know, that's just who he is. And like, he shows there's such a wide range. And little known fact, Freddy-Krueger was originally supposed to be like a different body type, and basically Robert Englund, for his audition, basically convinced Craven that it needed to be him. He basically came into the room, didn't say anything. He took like soot, smeared it on his eyes, and just stared deadpan at Craven until Craven gave him the job. Like, he was just super uncomfortable. And I think you kind of get a lot of that energy in this movie, and that's one of the reasons I feel like this movie is so memorable and just revisitable, is because of the performance that Englund gives throughout the course of it.
Well, what's funny is actually the original person who was supposed to play Freddy Krueger was Kane Hodder, who eventually goes on to play Jason Voorhees. He was, I think, the first person to do a screen test for Freddy, and they said that they were going to keep him in the back pocket because they wanted to see a few other people. He had the right build and body type for it, but he didn't really play the role the way Craven really wanted. And then they eventually went with David Warner, who had the official casting done, and he had makeup tests and everything done for him, who was also much taller, much bigger. And then, like you said, Robert Englund went in there and he did the face, he did the expressions and the stares at Craven, and Craven was just like, he's not as tall and as big as I'd hoped, but the acting is too spot on for me to not go with. So we'll take a test on him. They did the test run for the makeup, and he was sold.
I think another thing that this film does really well is when you look at what has come before it in the slasher genre, because, Mike, as you had said, like, a lot of this movie is very late into the slasher boom, that its origin is arguable, because you obviously had Black Christmas, you had Texas Chainsaw, but Halloween was kind of really what put it on the main stay in 1978. And then you had Friday the 13th, and then you started having these like just swarms of Halloween and Friday the 13th knockoffs. And when you move from there to this completely different guy, but when you look at those original just groundbreaking films, whether you're talking about Black Christmas, Texas Chainsaw, Halloween, Friday the 13th, the narrative does a really good job at kind of revolving it around a mystery of who is this killer, or you just don't see it to the degree that you see it in nowadays. And I think one of the things that really struck me on this last rewatch was just watching the way that Freddy was lit throughout the entire course of things. Because even though you do see his expressions and the way that he interacts with, Tina or Nancy throughout the course of this, or even Rod, the way that he's lit makes him more sinister. It's not just it's not just England, but it's the atmosphere which Craven is creating around England.
It's very dark. There's a lot of use of shadows with him, and I like that the whole concept of the boiler room, like that whole set, that was such a cool part of the movie, and I could tell how well that you could get that fear factor across to the audience, and you could see that it's just this maze that Freddy knows very well that your main characters are trying to navigate and figure out, and he can manipulate the dream world, right? So he's able to show up and do all kinds of things, and that's what really started to get me a little tripped up as I went through the movie, and I know it was done intentionally, but it's really blurs the lines to the point where I couldn't really tell what was the dream world and what wasn't, and I still could not. I would need to watch it probably a few more times to really definitively tell you, but I feel like it's purposely vague to make you as confused as the characters are throughout this movie.
Yeah, I definitely feel like Craven wanted to kind of cement, or not really cement, I blur the lines of what reality was when you're watching the film to kind of make the viewer almost question whether what they're seeing is even in their real world or if they're dreaming. And I think for the time that he did it, they did a really good job. And that's one thing I can give props to for the 2010 reboot, is in a lot of cases, unless they do an abrupt transition, you never really knew if the characters were asleep or awake until he showed up and you had this big jump scare and it's like, oh God, they're asleep. And 2010 actually did a really good job of that, and I'll give them the props for that one. But with the time that the original film came out, it was something people had never seen before in a slasher film, because you had Texas Chainsaw in 1974, where it was just a cannibal family kidnapping people, straightforward to the point. There was no mental aspect to that. Same thing with Michael Myers and Jason Voorhees. They were all just kind of relentless Terminator types where they had one goal in mind, and that was what they were doing. They're there to kill. And then you get to Freddy-Krueger, and it's just like, okay, now you have to separate a real world from a dream world. And you don't know where that line is, because honestly, in that time, people hadn't really started to study dreams like that, or the mental effect that dreams had on people, because a lot of people don't really talk about their dreams. They just kind of go to sleep, dream, and wake up, and they either remember their dream and say, wow, that was weird, or they forget about it within 5 minutes. So Craven playing with the whole aspect of the dream world was very, very new for cinema, because there'd never really been that kind of mind twist, so to speak.
Dan, I want to just jump off of what you were saying real quick. And there's a perfect scene in particular where it's at the very opening, and Tina has this dream exchange with Freddy, and then the camera pans to these 3 little girls jump roping, and then if you look at the way that it's shot, like it's shot with this like very intense tint, to where it's almost kind of like a neutral like color. It's not as bright as the rest of the film, and then it slowly just kind of fades into the real world of Nancy being picked up. And I think that that's kind of the example you're talking about. And Mike, also, there's a line in here where Nancy's mom is specifically talking about to this like sleep doctor, and Nancy has gone in for a couple of tests to better understand why she's not sleeping, or and the doctor says something along the lines of, we don't really understand sleeping yet. We don't really understand dreams or where it is they come from. And that's really interesting to me. And I it would even dare that, in the almost 35 years since this movie has been out, that we're also kind of still at this point where we don't really understand dreams, and I want to talk about that in just a few minutes. But since you brought up the 2010 remake, I want to bring up the 2010 remake real quick, and I want to talk about one particular scene that movie does better than this one. And that is the scene where Nancy falls asleep in class.
I do like how that scene was shot. It was the abrupt change.
Yeah.
Towards the middle of the scene was very eerie, and the binaural sounds that you hear in the background of the film as she gets up and walks into the hallway. It's like, when did we switch? It was very well done. I agree with you on that one.
So I think that the 2010 remake actually does it better. There's something about just the way that it's like atmospheric, the way that it's like shot, colored differently, and just the intensity that you experience with Freddy-Krueger in that particular scene between Chris and him is just, it's a very eerie sequence. But one thing that I have to kind of give it props for, the original scene I have to give props for, is this where she runs into the hall monitor, and the hall monitor is like, "Where's your pass?" And she's like, "Screw your pass," and she's like trying to like run out to follow a dead Tina, and as she's running in the halls, the hall monitor says "No running in class," and it's revealed to be Freddy. Like, that is just some of the slick just nature that Craven brings to this character, and I think that Freddy's a character that you can only do that with. And so that's all I have to say, because I feel like that's just a really there are aspects of the remake that I think kind of worked better for the franchise than the original did. But again, times have changed. I'm not trying to also open up a can of worms and talk about a remake versus original, because the original is always going to win in the end. But if you would like to hear us talk about remakes and battle each other, you can hear us talk about it on Patreon this month for as little as $1. How would you guys like to help us get mental health resources into schools, conventions, and other events? Well, now you can. Simply go to patreon.com/victims and villains for as little as $1 a month. You guys can help us get mental health resources into current and upcoming generations, educate and break down stigma surrounding mental health, suicide, and depression, and you get exclusive content that you can't get anywhere else. And you guys can tell us which Nicolas Cage movie you want us to cover, and we'll do it. All it takes to get started is to go to patreon.com/victims and villains, or simply click the link in the episode description wherever you guys are currently listening or streaming this episode. Pick your tier and get started today. Yes, it's that simple. So quickly select the tier that you want and help us get hope into the hands of the depressed and the suicidal today.
So since we brought up the remake again, I did find something kind of funny. Back to when we were talking about how Johnny Depp was cast as Glenn, I found out that the other person who was up for the role was actually a young Jackie Earle Haley. And they went to this audition together as friends, and Johnny Depp ended up getting the part. And then Haley never got a role in the film until he became Freddy in 2010.
Interesting.
I just think that's really funny.
That is so funny, because I don't ever think of Haley, like, in my opinion and in my mind, like, I know Jackie Earle Haley has done stuff, but to me, he just kind of didn't exist before Watchmen. So it's
that was my thing.
It's very bizarre to think about that.
The only other film that I had seen him in before Watchmen was Nemesis, and it's an old cyberpunk film from '92. So not a lot of people have ever heard of it, but he was in that film. He had a kind of a minor role, but I remember him from